I'm going to show you two photos back to back, and I want you to tell me what's wrong with them. Okay, here we go. It looks like a British battleship, maybe of the Queen Elizabeth or Royal Sovereign type. Or here's this one. For the casual naval history fan, it'd be fairly easy to tell that it's an Italian battleship, maybe of the Andrea Doria type or Caio de Giulio after their reconstructions. For the most part, you'd be right. There's just this little issue right here, at the bow of the ships. You see that flag? It looks Soviet. Well, you'd certainly have a keen eye. Both these ships, the British Royal Sovereign and the Italian Giulio Cesare, ended up in Soviet service. That begs the question, how? How did these Italian and British battleships end up in Soviet service? First up, we have to discuss the British battleship, the Royal Sovereign. Like the Queen Elizabeth, the Revenge class saw refits throughout the interwar period that improved their fighting capabilities, just not to the extent that some of the more radical reconstructions the QEs had, which by the time the Second World War kicked off in September of 1939, made the R class a less capable fighting unit than the modernized Queen Elizabeth. A great example of this is Royal Sovereign at the Battle of Calabria, where Admiral Andrew Cunningham, although with other hindrances, one of his chief ones was his speed was limited by the Royal Sovereign. By 3:50 p.m. on July 9, 1940, when Warspite was about to engage the two Italian dreadnoughts, Conte di Cavour and Giulio Cesare, the battleship Malaya had closed to around 3,000 yards of the flagship, while Royal Sovereign lagged 5 miles behind Warspite, remaining widely spread and out of range for the engagement. It had nothing to do with the effort of the crew. They strained their engines as hard as they could. Their problem was the fact that they could barely get 20 knots out of the ship, and by this point, her sister Ramillies couldn't even exceed that if she wanted to. With that being said, she continued to serve, mainly on escort duty in the North Atlantic after this, and spent time with the Eastern Fleet for convoy duty in the Indian Ocean, going to Philadelphia Dockyard for a refit between 1942 and October 1943, where her light anti-aircraft battery was greatly augmented. Due to manpower shortages, she was paid off and put into the reserves because there was more capable battleships in service by that point. It was no secret that Joseph Stalin longed for a modern navy, with the Soviet buildup of their battleships, the modernizations of the Gangets, and the buildup of destroyers and cruisers, some of them coming from Italian yards. And from the defeated Regia Marina, Stalin hoped to secure one of the modern battleships of the Littorio class, which we'll discuss that a bit later on. Thus, with the upgrades to the Royal Sovereign in mind and her being in the reserve, when the question arose of temporarily transferring ships to the Soviet Union instead of the immediate delivery of a portion of the Italian fleet, as it was not practical with the war continuation and Italian co-belligerency, the Royal Sovereign was in good enough shape and available. After negotiations, it was agreed that the Royal Navy would loan Royal Sovereign 9 destroyers and 4 submarines. On May 30th, 1944, the Soviet flag was raised on Royal Sovereign in Newcastle. Royal Sovereign became the Arc Anglaise, named for that city. Its English translation is Archangel, and so we're going to call it that from now on. It's incredibly hard to get details about her service in the Soviet Navy, and I'll detail what little there is. One of the more interesting facts is that her crew is mostly comprised of former crew members of the battleship Petropavlovsk, the ex-Murat, and if you don't know that name, give it a Google, he's quite the character. Anyway, the ship was added to the Soviet Navy list on May 9, 1944, even before she was officially transferred. It was some time before she was worked up with her new crew, departing Scapa Flow as part of convoy JW-59 in early August. Probably for the best, because by this point, the elderly battleship could make only 19 knots because her machinery needed a rather large and expensive overhaul. During that operation, it was attacked by the U-boat U-711, but the torpedoes would detonate short of their target, arriving at the Soviet port of Vyanga on the 24th of August. The ship rotated between there, Murmansk, or Polerny for the remainder of the war. In September and early October, several attacks by the U-boats U-315 and U-313 were thwarted by net defenses while the ship was moored near Murmansk. Another attack was halted because of mechanical failures, this time by 6 German midget submarines, often referred to as Bibers. After the German surrender, the Archangel made several cruises in the Barents and White Seas, running aground in the fall of 1947 in the White Sea Inlet. All the while back in the United Kingdom, there were calls to have the ships returned, notably by Winston Churchill, who, when he loaned the ship, the irony of the name the Royal Sovereign going to the Soviet Union was not lost on him. There were several attempts to get the battleship returned to the United Kingdom, with Stalin basically hoping the British would forget about it and he could keep it. The Prime Minister said, "I can see no reason why we, in return for such help to Russia and Italy, should leave our ships in Russian hands. We are entitled to get those ships back, and the scrap would be extremely useful to us at the present moment." The Admiralty saw no value in ships like Royal Sovereign, especially considering the fact that she hadn't received any major work while in Russian hands the past 4 years, and when they did hand her over, she wasn't exactly in the best condition. Still, after more hemming and hawing by the Soviets, she was returned in 1949 when the Soviets received their portion of the Italian fleet and received the Italian dreadnought Giulio Cesare. Royal Sovereign returned to the United Kingdom in what can only be described as an awful state, with reports detailing her being covered in rust, live rounds in the guns, and even some rusted in place. Unsurprisingly, the ship was placed on the disposal list almost immediately and was sent to be scrapped a short time later. Where the Giulio Cesare comes into play is following the signing of the armistice in September 1943. Italian ships, including the Giulio Cesare, left Italy for internment in Allied ports, where some of Giulio Cesare's crew, resenting having to turn their ships over to the British, en route to Malta, they effected what amounted to a mutiny, seizing control of the ship to sink her in deep water, relenting only after the captain solemnly pledged not to allow the British to take possession of the ship under any circumstance. This was one of the only few episodes of reaction to the armistice within the Regia Marina, either ashore or at sea. All this to say, Giulio Cesare wasn't going to see service for the remainder of the war, having her crew reduced and the ship remaining at Malta for the foreseeable future, where she was at the mercy of the weather, having damage done to her during her time there. There was hope in the Italian government that Cesare and some of the other battleships could be brought back into service following the war, with the government going as far as to detail how this could be done. The problem was Joseph Stalin longed for a modern navy, including modern battleships, hoping to receive one of the Littorio class as reparations, as well as more ships. He was promised a portion of the Italian fleet in a prior meeting with the Western powers. But, spoiler, he was not going to get one of those modern battleships. Although he did get the British Royal Sovereign temporarily, we'll cover her terrible service with the Soviets in more detail at a later point. Anyway, Giulio Cesare eventually returned to Italy in June 1944, where, after handing over the firing mechanisms to British authorities, she laid in Taranto's Mar Piccolo in desperate need of repairs at reduced readiness and active, being this way up until January 1946, where she was placed in available status. This only lasted a year when she was placed back into reduced readiness, awaiting the fate reserved for her by the peace treaty. The Soviets continued to try to obtain one of the Littorio-class battleships with remarkable persistence, and who can blame them? In my Fates of the Littorio-class video, the battleships were shown to be in excellent condition, especially considering their age and how long they'd been sitting around. But the Soviets would not get their hands on either the Littorio or Vittorio Veneto, because those were allocated to the Americans and British, eventually to be broken up in Italian ports. But what did they get? On February 10, 1947, Italy signed the peace treaty imposed on her by the victorious powers in Paris, involving the loss of territory, material, and moral sacrifices, where Mino Bagnesco and Augusto de Toro in Italian battleships Conte di Cavour and Giulio classes 1911 to 1956 write, "The greatest bitterness came from the treatment of the Italian fleet as if it were war booty to be divided up amongst the victors." The battleships were divided up, with the British and Americans receiving the two remaining Littorio class, and the Italians were allowed to keep the Giulios. With the Conte di Cavour sunk, it left Giulio Cesare to be handed over to the Soviet Union. Like I mentioned before, the Soviets were promised a portion of the Italian fleet, totaling some 51,464 tons, including the Giulio Cesare, a light cruiser, 3 destroyers, 3 torpedo boats, 2 submarines, and 35 other vessels. The treaty was not exactly popular with the Italian people or navy. Again quoting De Toro and Bagnesco, "The delivery of these ships was seen by Italian sailors as well as by the greater part of the population not only as unfair and humiliating, but also as a renewed and unequivocal sign of defeat, which co-belligerency had managed to erase from the memory of many. The delivery of ships was going to be made because of the discipline of the officers and crews, avoiding the real danger of the possible dissolution of the Italian navy. It should be noted, some plans were foiled to sabotage Giulio Cesare and other ships before they were handed over to the Soviet Union. This theme of Italian anger is something that will be important later on, so keep that in the back of your mind." By the time Cesare was going to be transferred to the Soviet Navy, she had been inactive for the better part of 3 years, almost devoid of crew, at a very reduced state of readiness, and not in great condition. The treaty stipulated that the ships were to be ready for service, i.e. in operational condition, by September 15, 1947, which for Cesare was not going to happen. This will become apparent shortly. After some negotiating, Moscow agreed in July 1948 that the ships could be handed over in their current condition. By September 1948, the Giulio Cesare and other ships promised to the Soviet Union were on their way with their stores full of everything that the ship could need, making a stop at the Albanian port of Valona where the ships were going to be handed over. On February 6, 1949, the documents were finally signed, handing over the battleship to the Soviet Union. The Italian crews were treated rather harshly, quickly removing them from their posts and keeping them under guard on the forecastle. The Soviets were very worried about the prospect of sabotage, something that might have happened to another Russian dreadnought, the Empress Maria, 42 years ago at that point. The Soviets searched the ship up and down, looking for any explosive devices, but they didn't find any. The ship assumed, although still provisionally, the name Novorossiysk, in honor of the city of that name of the Black Sea, which had resisted a prolonged German siege, arriving in Sevastopol on the 26th. The Soviet authorities began to complain almost immediately with the condition the ship was in, with Stephen McLaughlin in Soviet and Russian battleships reporting her condition with the armament, main machinery, hull structure, bulkheads below the waterline, armored deck, all being satisfactory, while the bulkheads above the armored deck, watertight doors, and hatches were unsatisfactory. Things that were in poor condition were the piping, internal communication systems, auxiliary machinery, firefighting systems, and diesel generators, which were non-operational. Bagnesco and De Toro describe her as having rust almost everywhere, and the light anti-aircraft guns being useless due to their poor condition. Italian sources report the Soviets who were in charge of the handover were mainly inspecting the ship to see if everything was there and if there were any attempts to sabotage the ship, not the state the equipment was in. Maintenance was constantly carried out on the ship before her official entrance ceremony to the Black Sea Fleet on March 5, 1949, being given a cleaning and a fresh coat of gray paint. The ship was subject to propaganda as a great triumph for the Soviet Union as it had acquired a battleship from a defeated fascist foe. Despite the fact that the ship was not modern and of a type that was largely outdated, it was nevertheless the largest ship in service with the Black Sea. Being such, she became the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, assuming the role of a training ship to get the sailors of the fleet ready. But a lot of her time in Soviet service was spent being refit. Between 1949 and 1955, she underwent 8 rounds of work, major and minor, including the complete overhaul of her machinery, meaning her boilers and turbines, along with replacing a lot of the auxiliary and emergency diesel generators. Next, her main battery was planned to be changed with new Russian 305mm guns, but the ship was lost before this change could occur. The major armament modifications was the replacement of the Breda 20mm guns with more modern Soviet anti-aircraft guns, new fire control systems, telephone systems, and other upgrades that made the ship quite capable by the spring of 1955, even though she had been in service for over 40 years, and the nearly 1,600 men and officers were finally getting the hand of the elderly battleship when in October of 1955, she would finally meet her end. We've covered her loss in another video, link in the description, but I just wanted to describe how this occurred, why the Soviets ended up with a British and Italian battleship. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and please remember to like and subscribe, as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great day.